welcome to the Managing Violence podcast, the internet's leading free resource on violence prevention, threat assessment, personal security and self-protection, brought to you by R2S Violence Prevention. We are #ForTheProtectors. I'm your host, Joe Saunders. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of the Managing Violence podcast. I'm super excited this week to have one of my personal inspirations, Dr. Jim Cawood, joining us again on the podcast to talk about threat assessment and management. Before we get to that, quick reminder, if you are in the UK or you're anywhere near the UK and you fancy the idea of having a seminar with me, hosting a workshop with me, having me come in and teach a session at your dojo, or even just sharing a pint, by all means, please check out violencepod.com/UK tour. I will be in the UK end of March, early April 2022, and keen to catch up with as many listeners as I possibly can. So violencepod.com/UK tour for full details on that. Also a reminder to check out our Patreon, patreon.com/managing violence. If you're interested in supporting this show, but also getting access to a ton of free content. In this particular episode, rather than doing the standard questions, we actually get Dr. Jim Cawood to do a case study. One of the more interesting cases from his career, and when you consider that's a career that involves 5,000 plus interventions of violence, there's some pretty interesting stuff. But this is one of the more interesting cases that he has personally been part of and is happy to share about. So you would be a fool not to spend your $5 and hear that story. And astute listeners may have noticed that we are sponsored by R2S Violence Prevention. It's a little bit of a cheeky sponsorship because I'm the national practice lead for R2S Violence Prevention, and we are Australia's leading force for workplace and overall violence prevention. No matter what you need, whether it's consulting, whether it's training, whether it's security guards, executive protection, or anything in between, we have options for you to be able to help keep you safe from violence. By all means, please check us out at www.risk2solution.com. That's risk2solution.com for R2S Violence Prevention. All right, that'll do us. It's time to get into the fantastic interview with Dr. Jim Cawood. Here we go. I'm joined here on the Managing Violence podcast once again by Dr. Jim Cawood. Jim, thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me back. It was fun the first time. Yeah,
I'm glad. I'm glad you didn't turn me down the second time. So that's always a good sign. Now, for listeners' sake, this podcast isn't being released until the end of October, but for perspective, we're currently recording on September 11, the 20th anniversary of 9/11 in the US. It's the 12th here, but it's the 11th where Jim is. So, Jim, I really do appreciate you making the time on this day of all days to talk to us about threat assessment and threat intervention.
Well, you're welcome, but what better time to talk about it? Yeah.
Well, that's right. I mean, it's if ever it's going to be topical, then we should talk about it when people want to hear about it. So,
yep.
Jim, the first episode that we did, we spoke a lot about. Obviously, we introduced your background. So, if you're listening to this episode and you haven't heard the first one, which I think was episode 90, then go back and listen to that one if you want to hear Jim's backstory, or else we'll spend the first 15 minutes repeating ourselves. But we spoke a lot about the introduction to what threat assessment is, and about the the origin of that term and the work that goes into threat assessment. We touched on threat intervention, or we touched a little bit on intervention, and obviously your book, or the book you wrote with Mike Cochran, is Violence Assessment and Intervention. And I think the assessment piece is something that we've talked about a bit, but we haven't really talked about what the intervention is previously. So I guess probably my first question for you, and this is just to set the scene and define some terms, the difference between response, intervention, and even you reference in the book the separation between response, intervention, and punishment. Do you want to walk us through what are the difference between those terms?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And these are differentiations, I think, that are really important to communicate not only to the people that we're protecting, but also to the people that we're training in terms of what this means. So a response is an action that's taken by a threat assessor or or a security professional or someone else on a threat assessment team that is meant to further the purpose of the assessment process and gathering of information, or the process of beginning to put in place protective capability, all with the understanding and the intent of not having any of that process or those steps being known by the person that we're intervening with. So in other words, the person of concern should have no awareness that we're doing these things, and that's a response. So, that would be like, for instance, starting a background investigation, or, interviewing collateral witnesses, or doing a police liaison, or, developing a security team plan, or all those things are going to be what we call responses. And they have no intent whatsoever of having it influence or otherwise in any way affect the person of concern. These are structural and background related and assessment and other related processes. When we're talking about interventions, we're talking about those things that are meant and intended to have some form of influence on that person's behavior. So in other words, the person of concern's behavior. So these are things that we're going to be doing with the expressed intent as either a part or completely for the purpose of influencing this person not to act violently. And again, that's the thing that's really important for us to understand. From the first episode, we talked about the idea that the gold standard for this work is to get the person of concern to willingly choose from their own perception of reality not to continue along a pathway to violence, because they no longer perceive that that is their best method to achieve their goal. So we're literally influencing their thinking. And you notice I'm not saying persuasion. It's influence. And why it's different, and again, I've written I'm so interested in this topic, and frankly, Joe, there's been so little. I mean, there's a chapter, as you pointed out, in my book with Mike on interventions. It's a pretty short chapter, but I think this was so important that actually I wrote a follow-on book that came out with academic press in the world called Threat and Violence Interventions: The Effective Application of Influence. And that came out at the end of 2020. And I specifically wrote it just on interventions because I wanted to because I thought it was an underappreciated and under thought about area, and yet it's critical. When you ever look at threat assessment and management, everyone talks about the idea that assessment without intervention is basically useless, that knowing what the level of risk may pose is the probability of risk, but then not using that information to effectively intervene to decrease the risk is obviously not helpful. And so that it should be our primary goal, and yet almost no one writes on it. Stephen Hart's has written on the issue of doing case formulation, but case formulation is about how you understand a case and what you may do. It certainly does lead to intervention and response and intervention, but he doesn't get down in the weeds and talk about what to do. And when I've seen it, it's all around. When I've seen someone talk about it, it's all about clinical intervention. We're going to get this person therapy, or we're going to do this, or we're going to do that. It's never really down into the weeds of what most people will be able to do and do effectively and do short term and do, in a way which is going to be safe for the individual and the community versus a long-term thing. I mean, I get maybe 2 hours with an individual that I'm assessing, and I'm trying to intervene at the same time, and we'll get back to that. And then obviously there's an ongoing effort to continue to influence that individual, but that's going to usually be at a distance. This is not like I'm going to get 7 sessions. I'm not going to get 25 sessions, with psychotherapy. And that often doesn't work anyway. So how do we practically do this in a way which is pretty dramatic? And again, we're not trying to influence the person to have happy and be happy with their life and everyone sings Kumbaya and moves on. This is about just getting them below threshold, influencing them just below threshold so they choose not to act violently. They can still be angry at the individuals. They can still be angry at the organizations. They still may want all those people to die. They're just not going to be the ones to do it. And so response is about what they don't know what's going on around them that helps the process move forward and helps safety maybe to start to develop. Intervention is about, again, those attempts to influence. And there's a kind of a short list of things we can do in industrialized societies, in any society, frankly, to influence people, and so we'll talk about those intervention options in a second. The last one you talked about was punishment, and the problem is that when we begin to look at interventions from the lens of punishment rather than the lens of influence, they become less and less effective. So in other words, we have a tendency in Western societies in particular, but also in many societies that have the rule of law, we talk about rehabilitation and we talk about having the individual, change their ways, and supposedly punishment is about making the individual not want to do the crime again. But we know from high recidivism rates that actually it doesn't function in that category.
Yeah.
We wouldn't have 70 to 80% recidivism rates for people that are coming out of prison and going back to prison if in fact punishment worked. And so, but we don't really believe in Western cultures. We don't believe in, and frankly, most cultures that under the rule of law, we don't believe actually in rehabilitation. We believe in punishment. And we want that person to feel the pain and feel the hurt and the loss that they've incurred to society. And because of that, of course, that's why it doesn't work. Because ultimately, very few people that have reached that point can't justify their way out of why they did it. And this is when you talk to criminals. If you do talk to criminals, it's always like, well, it wasn't my fault. That person shouldn't have done that. Or that person had more than I had. Or, I was raised in a bad situation and therefore I have the right to take. All these kinds of excuses and rationalizations that we get out of criminals. And of course, those same kinds of things, even if they're not criminal, happen with stalkers, happen with individuals that are domestic terrorists, happen with others that we're doing in the threat, that we're trying to manage the threats. They all have a rationalization for what they're doing. And so what we really need to do is be able to influence them, meaning understand how they perceive the world through our assessment process, and then be able to interact with them in a way which is congruent with how they view the world, and yet provides new information, or for them an opportunity to learn new information, to be aware of new information that then leads them away from needing to act violently. So when you're looking at, so I'll pause there, but those are the three different levels, right? So we're talking about response, we're talking about intervention, and of course then we want to avoid punishment, and we want to avoid the appearance of punishment when we're doing intervention. So a classic example of that would be, a disciplinary action. So, when we look at, let's say, a workplace violence individual who comes in and they do some bad act, or they stalk someone, or they threaten people, or whatever. But the assessment at the time isn't that there's such a high risk that they are going to be expelled from the organization. Of course, they could still be terminated, but so they either get kept, or let's assume for a moment they're going to be kept, and then we give them a disciplinary action. The idea being that administrative or disciplinary action will be kind of like, smacking their wrist and doing the things that we would do in the criminal justice system by arrest. And basically we're saying, you're going to get in trouble. And then we write these letters. And here's the thing that always blows my mind. And I get involved in rewriting disciplinary letters, rewriting administrative action letters, rewriting even lawsuits that are being filed, and the testimony for restraining orders. And we'll talk about that during today's podcast. I get involved in all that because it's just shocking to me about how we craft the interactions we have with these people and the words we put down on paper, and how we take these actions with no apparent insight into how that individual is going to respond to it. And of course, it just makes the situation worse. So, as an example, you discipline someone, and basically the language is very harsh. You violated policy. You egregiously didn't do what the code of conduct was. We are now placing you on administrative leave for 3 weeks without pay. Should you violate the policy again, you will be immediately terminated.
Yeah.
Well, wait a minute. I'm going to get that letter. I'm going to read it 400 times, and all it's going to do is make me angry. There's no acknowledgement about what I experienced. There's no acknowledgement about why I may have done that. There's no acknowledgement of the fact that there's redemption. You're just basically punishing me like a parent would, spank a child. And of course, that's just going to make me angry. It's not going to change anything, right? On the other hand, if I have talked to the individual and I say, during the course of our interview, I learned that you perceived that this person had done these things to you, and that because of that, you felt this response was justified. Even though we've heard that clearly, we discussed the idea, we discussed the reality, we discussed that this behavior still is in violation of our policy, and therefore we are obligated to place you on leave with the understanding that should it reoccur, then we will no longer be able to continue our working relationship.
Mm-hmm.
See the difference in the language there?
Absolutely. Acknowledging
what they've told us, and having them understand we heard them, but it doesn't change the outcome, but it totally changes necessarily their perception of how we're treating them, and therefore what they may need to do in the future. Yeah?
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's the kind of thing we're talking about in terms of and that's just an example, but I mean, there's a lot of examples, but so I'm going to pause there, but there's still a lot more to cover, but I mean, does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's sort of, there's parallels there when you think about like for example, workplace shooters as an example. If they feel like there's nothing left to lose, then why not? Right? The punishment doesn't matter because they're not planning to get out of there alive anyway most of the time. So like if I don't have any hope of keeping my job, if I don't have any hope of keeping my financial security or providing for my family or whatever the emotional trigger is for me out of this, and I'm already feeling disrespected and I'm already feeling like I'm not appreciated, and I get a letter that basically just reaffirms those beliefs, well, the logical thing is to escalate. Right? How is it going to de-escalate me?
Certainly, it's maybe not the logical thing, but it's certainly the normal reaction.
Oh, well, of course, yeah.
I think
might be a strong word.
Yeah, well, there you go. So, I think you're exactly right. I mean, I think that even flows through the security, though. I mean, all of us that have, that are aware of your podcast and are aware of all the good work you've done in this area. I mean, many of us are probably Dalton fans, right? So we all, we all recognize that, Dalton in that movie Roadhouse, right? Mm-hmm. You're nice until it's time not to be nice anymore, and then the reaction has got to be pretty quick flip, and that's the whole point, though, is being nice first. Right? Is being reasonable first, is being calm first. And then if you have to be harsh, you can always get harsher, but you can't ever get less harsh. Once you set the harshness scale, you can't really dial it back.
Yeah, it's hard to say I didn't really mean it.
Yes, exactly right. And I think that's the real thing that we're missing over and over and over again. And this is, being a former law enforcement street cop in California, before I, went into this work, that was what I was trained to do. I was trained to be, the authority on the street. I was the guy, one riot, one ranger, go in and get it done. And actually, when I think back on some of the better officers that I interacted with when I was on the force, they didn't have that attitude already. Even though it was the late 70s, they had already evolved past that to understand that, yeah, when you had to be harsh, you had to be harsh. When you had to take action, you take action. But in the meantime, there's a tremendous amount of things in domestic violence cases and in stalking cases and in other related investigations where you didn't have to be harsh on the bad person. You could just be conversational. And you could have these interactions with people, and it would really decrease the risk to everyone and maximize the possibility of getting new information. And this flows into, again, off topic a little bit, but it flows into what we talked about last time around using the enhanced cognitive interview and around using motivational interviewing as a basis for doing our threat assessment interviews, because it's a much less, it's this conversation approach. It's not a confrontation approach when we're talking to people of concern. And that's really what this is all about in terms of intervention. So as when we're looking at the bucket of interventions, it's a pretty short list in terms of what we have, right? We have interviews, and we'll talk about there's a crossover between those two things, but we have between the assessment piece and the intervention piece. But we have interviews, we have voluntary physical or mental health evaluations, right? That's an intervention, but voluntary is always better than involuntary. We have voluntary treatment options, again, assuming that the case is, involving that. We have the administrative or disciplinary actions we talked about, right? That are meant, if they're couched correctly, are going to be corrective and supportive rather than punitive and punishing.
Mm-hmm.
We have requests to redirect or cease communications or desist communications, both verbal and in writing, and we'll talk about the differences there. No trespass orders, which are a milder version of restraining orders, right? Just basically, this is not an area where this is now a prohibited space for you. Please don't return. And then we have restraining orders, and obviously there's a lot of talk, both written about in my book about that, as well as in the new book on restraining orders, and again, how they are thought about as being really a very effective tool, and they can be, but unfortunately, sometimes when they're sought at the wrong time, and they're sought in a way which is so harsh and demeaning that actually they cause further problems. I mean, there was an interesting study that was done in San Diego where they looked at domestic violence restraining orders that were issued over a period of time in San Diego in California courts. And what they did was they looked at the issue of whether or not a mutual restraining order or a one-sided restraining order was more effective in decreasing violence. And for one particular, and I'm not going to call out culture here, but in one particular culture that's representative to a great degree in San Diego, what they found was in that particular issuance of restraining orders in that culture, when the restraining orders were issued mutually, in over 100 cases, mutually issued. In other words, both parties were told to stay away from each other. Violence dropped to zero after the restraining order. When it was only unilateral, one side was told to stay away from the other side, violence didn't decrease from the pace that it had before the restraining order was issued. In other words, it had zero effect on ongoing violence. Yeah.
Because if only one party is issued, whether you're basically you're telegraphing this is you are the culprit.
Yes,
this
exactly.
Is your
you're the bad person.
You're the bad person. Whereas,
right.
And I imagine in a high number of those cases, the other party, even if they are legitimately the bad person, they still feel justified by the actions of the person they're abusing. So. Yeah,
they do. And in some cases, they're actually, basically also saying, look, the court told me I can't do this, and I'm going to show you I don't care what the court does. So in essence, they're not only reacting to the individual victim, but they're also reacting to the court saying you can't stop me and can't tell me what to do, which actually they can't, because the court's not standing around trying to keep them apart. Right.
That's right.
So ultimately, the violations always happen, and then people are hurt. So, but now there's legal consequences to getting a restraining order against you. And so I'm not suggesting that, mutual restraining orders are the way to go, and issuance of all restraining orders by any stretch of the imagination. And as you pointed out, often the bad person really does need to be restrained, and it's not the victim's fault. However, what I'm suggesting is behaviorally, it shows you some of the things we have to consider here, right? And same thing, and then we go from that to involuntary mental health evaluation and involuntary mental health treatment, which frankly has very limited value unless there's a long-term commitment, and we'll talk about that too. And then we have the arrest, obviously, and we talked about weakness of arrest, criminal filing, protective orders, prosecution, probation, and parole. Those are all interventions. The problem is, as we start going past the voluntary stuff and we start getting into restraining orders and involuntary and arrest and all that stuff, really what we're doing is we're taking away more and more opportunities to have that person believe that they're reaching the conclusion themselves. It's no longer in their best interest to do these, to follow a path of violence. We're putting external controls on them as if that's going to work. And actually, just like anything else, if I put a brace on my knee and I rely on that external control brace on my knee, all my ligaments start getting weaker. And it's the same thing with interventions. If I'm relying on an external thing to control someone's behavior, their need to participate and build up their own strength of intent and their own ability to self-sustain a good course of conduct is weakened because they're being controlled from outside. And this is where controlling parents, as an example, if you want to get very, psychological for a minute, controlling parents lead to weak children who then act out because they haven't learned self-control. They haven't learned themselves how to control themselves, their emotions, and the consequences, and they haven't been asked to take responsibility for those. Their parents have saved them. And this is where one of the, again, we could get into a whole other thing, but just a classic example of this is, I don't know how many high school kids have curfews up to the moment they go to college, if they go to college, or they go on to the work environment. The minute they graduate from high school, all of a sudden there are no curfews. They're adults. They go into the community, and what do we see? We see an inordinate amount of acting out behaviors, because they all of a sudden, from going under fairly complete control to no control, but they've had no training on how to manage themselves with no control. They flunk out of the first semester of college. They get into binge drinking. They do all sorts of crazy stuff, and it's because if the parents had actually started teaching them from the entrance into high school, along the way of taking more and more responsibility for what they were doing, for their time, for their money, for everything, they would have been ready to be an adult at 18. So anyway, that's just giving you an example of that weakness that's caused by external controls versus the nurturing of internal controls.
Yeah, there's an interesting parallel there. I was thinking about a conversation I had with someone from the correctional system about how someone can be a model prisoner, and then the second they're released, they go back reoffending again, because it's easy to behave well when you're in a system that enforces it.
That's right.
So there's very limited self-control required to behave well in prison, right? Because it's very, I mean, obviously there are those that still struggle with it, but there's no guarantee that as soon as you're back out with no one watching you, that you're not going to misbehave, because you have a lot more free choice, and free choice leads to having to make those difficult decisions.
Well, and this is why, frankly, assessment of people upon release to probation and parole and out of prison, why our threat assessments are so bad, is because the people that are doing the assessments are doing them on people inside a controlled environment, and the assessors aren't doing enough to project based on prior free motion, free roaming, right? They're not doing a good enough job of risk formulation of what happens when they don't have to show up. They don't have to. They have a week until they have to see their probation officer. They are going to have more free time in the halfway house. How do they calculate that into their risk assessment? And they do a fairly poor job of it in many cases. And so we have these huge failures because they're not taking the stance you just took, which is, okay, this guy's great inside the prison, but we're controlling everything he or she does. Now what?
Yeah, exactly.
What are they going to act like when they have no control?
Yeah.
And they don't talk to them about it. I mean, and what's so fascinating to me about it is that a lot of times they don't get into their heads and don't have conversations with them, long conversations with them about, okay, so now you have all this free time. What are you actually going to do with it? I know you're going to tell me you're going to go find a job. I know you're going to tell me you're going to go to therapy. You're going to do all this stuff. But what do you really see yourself doing? What do you think you're capable of doing?
Yeah.
What concerns do you have about being able to do that? And of course, then mental illness plays into it too, and it's even worse, right? So, most psychotropic drugs take 21 to 32 days to reach titration. I don't care if it's an antidepressant, antipsychotic, whatever it is, right? And a lot of jails and prison are basically mental health wards now.
Yep.
And so, but that takes that long to titrate the drug and get it to have some effect on your mental health. So now I get released from prison, and the average amount of drugs being given to a prisoner upon leaving, antipsychotics, antidepressants, is 2 weeks. And the amount of time it takes them to engage with services in the community that will then get them their additional drugs is another 3 weeks. So now we're 5 weeks out, 3 weeks of which is guaranteed to now be without drugs. That's 21 days. So now I'm no longer being controlled by the drugs. Why would I go continue to seek drugs that affect my behavior? Because I'm not already psychotic again.
Yeah.
And now we wonder why we have a cycle. Because we're not thinking through, right? We're not doing the right thing. So anyway, so this is all about intervention, though, and why we bring it back to the topic. All this thinking of ahead. How does this person view the world? What matters to them? how do I begin to interact with them during that interview? As an example, when I'm doing the interview, the first half of those interviews are going to be assessing the individual, testing my hypothesis that I had my chief hypothesis coming into the interview of how this person views the world, and then using that information during the second half of the interview to test out different options. What would happen if what happens if you get their disciplinary action? What happens if you get terminated? What happens if you get arrested? What happens if? And talking with them about what their perceptions of that are. What are they going to do about it? And then what would happen then? Would that be of value to them? I remember a case where a case in the Midwest in the United States where I had a conversation with a guy just like this. And he was on this, very clearly had some mental health issues, but was working every day, was doing his job, actually fairly talented engineer, and loved his family. And he really was angry with the supervisor, and he really was he was starting to spiral. He was starting to get to the point where he basically was willing to give it all up. And we got to a point in the conversation where in this interview, when I just said to him, I said, so let's talk about that. What would happen if the organization decided to let you go? Well, I'd come back and kill them all. And I said, okay, so let's talk about that. How would you do that? And he had a pretty good plan for how he was going to do it. And I said, all right, so then what happens? And he goes, well, what do you mean? He goes, they'd be dead. I said, so then what happens to you? Well, I'd be dead. And so I said, you kill yourself? And he goes, yeah. I said, okay, so what happens to your family? Well, what do you mean? Well, you talk to me about how much you love your family, how much you've gone to your soccer games, how much you've done all these things, and you clearly have shown this deep connection to your family and taking care of them. So I'm struggling with understanding what happens to them if you do this. You notice I didn't say he was wrong. You see where I'm going with this, right? Struggling with this. So help me understand that connection. He goes, oh. I said, yeah, one of the challenges I'm seeing here is that now you're gone. Your son doesn't have someone he can look up to. In fact, actually, everyone in the community is telling them that you were a crazy person who was going to kill people. And your wife now has no support. There's no money. Do your kids get fed? Do they get to go to school? Who's going to take care of them? What's going to happen? And he actually sat there and he said, I really haven't thought about that. And I said, so let's think about it. And we spent another 20, 25 minutes just kind of mulling that over. And he said to me at the end of the interview, he said, he says, I'm really angry with these people. And I said, yeah, I know you are. I said, the question is, what do you want to do about it? And he says, my family's more important to me than they are.
Wow.
And I said, I hear you. And he said, so you know what? It's not going to get better here, is it? I said, no, it's really not going to get better here. Yeah, I said, you've done all these things. You've scared all these people. You said all these words. I said, if you were in their position, and of course I'm testing empathy. Yeah.
Yeah.
If you were in there, now that we've had this connection, which is different than we had coming into the interview, I said, so if you were now sitting where they are and they were hearing these things, would you want to work with you anymore? And he goes, no, I really wouldn't. And I said, and frankly, it wouldn't be fair to you. And he goes, what do you mean it wouldn't be fair to me? And I said, think about it. You now stay here. They decide to keep you. And next time you don't get a promotion, or next time that there's an assignment available or whatever, if you don't get it, you're always going to be wondering if it's because they still hold you accountable for what you've done, and you're really getting a fair shot. So not only are they worried potentially about what you may do, but you're going to be concerned about the fact that you have no more opportunities, because the fact is that you're always going to wonder whether or not you just didn't get something that you wanted or needed, because they still believe that you're not one of them. I said, so how fair is that to you going forward? And this guy was 45. So, I mean, he was clearly had some runtime on his, as he's perceived it, and as I did too, on his work life. And so he said, he goes, you're right. so I'm just going to resign. And I said, okay. I said, I'm not asking you to resign, and that's certainly a choice of yours, right? But that would be something that I'm sure that they would consider. And then I convinced the company to actually allow him to resign rather than firing him. Does that see the difference?
Yeah.
And, there's going to be a neutral reference. Now, people are going to say, well, wait a minute, he said all these things about the company. But remember, so how are you going to give him a reference? Well, you give him a reference because he was there a certain amount of time, doing a certain amount of work, and got paid a certain amount of money. That's a standard reference. No one was going to comment on his work life. And people are saying, well, wait a minute, you're putting a dangerous person back into that another environment, and you're putting other people at risk. But am I? In other words, violence is a biopsychosocial, contextual, and environmental issue. His issue was in that context with those people at that company. It wasn't working in general. It wasn't every company. It wasn't society. It was this unique set of circumstances. Does that make sense? And so there was no indication that he was going to pose a risk to any other employer. Could it happen? Sure, it could happen, but a lot more opportunity for it not to happen.
And contrast that with him just being terminated and read the riot act and had police informed on him. And I mean, what are the chances that he never thinks through the consequences of that decision?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's where, when we're looking at security as an example, did I have security backing me up when I did that interview? Oh, yeah. I was actually carrying a gun during that interview too, right? Even though I knew I probably wouldn't be able to draw it fast enough, the fact is that I legally can carry it. I'm trained to carry it, and frankly, having it with me, and I also had a baton, but I mean, having it with me is going to be something that if I needed it and had the opportunity to use it, of course I would. But I was figuring I'd have to go hands-on if it got that way in the room. But my point is that did I have a security team? Sure. Were they ever visible? No. One of the things that really gets me about this, and we learned this early on in the process, I'm talking about late 80s, we began to learn that having visible security, as if it's going to be a prophylactic to keep people calm when they're going to a room, it does the opposite. Much along the lines of what we earlier talked about, Joe. If an individual who's being interviewed is aware security is hovering around them, waiting for them to go off, in essence, what they're hearing is, you already think I'm dangerous. No matter what I say, you're not really interested in changing your opinion of me. And if you're going to treat me like a mad dog, why wouldn't I just act to your expectation?
Yep.
So we found visible security to actually be very provocative. And so when I do security, particularly in organizational settings, I'll have security nearby, and I talk about this in the book, in a nearby room, usually listening in, or at least in the case where we can't listen in because of electronic surveillance, we can put in non-listening video in a common space like an interview room, so I can do hand signals. I talk about this in the book with Mike, hand signals to indicate if I need certain levels of intervention, disruption, distraction, and also what happens if I get into a hostage situation. The guy has a weapon and pulls it out during the interview, and there's a hostage situation. I need that room locked down, and that person can't leave the room. We can't let them start migrating through the facility with a weapon. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So the security team has to lock that down, and then obviously call for hostage negotiation. And that includes putting obviously a radio, as an example, turned off in a high-risk case underneath the trash liner of the trash can inside the room, so that I can use it in case the phones get ripped out of the walls, right? So there's a whole variety of things we do here that we've learned to do over time to manage that. But the point is that security, I want people to show up believing that we're expecting them to act reasonably, and act reasonably with them, and treat them reasonably. And that way we don't set them off, and hopefully they'll never know security was even there. I don't walk people out to their cars. Not only is it unsafe to walk people off the premises after I interview them, because of course, once I get to their car, what happens if they pull out a gun, right?
Yeah.
But also it shows them that I trust them. So I walk them to the door. Don't misunderstand me. I have them under surveillance in some way, whether or not electronic or by someone in the parking lot or across the way with opticals. I still have them under surveillance, but I stop at the door, thank them, let them wander, go to their car as if they're completely free and clear, but with a plan if they start to come back in that facility, obviously to meet them outside and have a conversation about why they're coming back. we had a case like that. It was really funny. He started coming back, and I stepped out the door. I was alerted that he was coming back, so I step out the door and meet him outside the framework of the building. I said, "So what's going on?" And he goes, "Oh, I forgot to tell you that I need to talk to HR about this." And I said, "Okay, I'll take care of it." So it wasn't like a code 3 situation. He wasn't coming back to do something bad. He had just like literally forgotten to tell me something, right? Yep. But everyone's like panicked. Everyone's like, "Oh my God, he's coming back!" They're all freaking out. It's like, no, we got this under control. It's fine. It's all good. And again, you're nice till it's time not to be nice anymore. And so that's all that rolls into this perception. And we need to give people perceptions that they have choices, and they're making those choices themselves. And we're not trying to persuade them. Persuasion requires, if I persuade someone to do something, it's a very weak form of influence. Because if I persuade someone to do something, a couple things have to happen. One, they have to acknowledge that my perception is better than theirs. They have to abandon their perception, and then they have to act on my direction, which means they have to be willing to give up a semblance of control to me. And that's a huge ask. And that's why persuasion is only limited in time frame to strength, because usually you persuade someone to do it once, and the next time you ask them to do the same thing, they now harden again because they don't want to give up control twice. Where if I can influence them, provide them new ideas, or talk through different perceptions, and they choose to do something different, that now becomes their preferred method of dealing with that similar type of situation, because they've chosen it before, it worked before, therefore they're going to do it again. It's not about giving something off back to me, or giving something up to me, or admitting they were wrong. They're choosing. And that's much more powerful. And this goes to everything from spouses to kids to coworkers to politicians to whoever. I mean, this is a human dynamic thing that we can use in practice throughout all aspects of our lives. And it's much more, I'll be frank, if you start using it in your private life, any listener here starts using that kind of thinking in their private life, you're going to find all your relationships smooth out, and you get a lot more of what you want.
There's so much wisdom in that. I mean, not just from obviously from an intervention or threat intervention point of view, but just human relationships. I mean, and whenever you've been persuaded to do anything, you've been coerced to do anything.
Yep.
I have, like, one of the things in my life, I don't hold many grudges. I have one grudge against a photographer who coerced my new wife and I straight after the birth of our first daughter. We quote unquote won a free photo shoot, or a luxury photo shoot, and then we had all the sales tricks pulled on us at the last minute to purchase $1,500 worth of photos.
Oh wow!
Yeah. And looking back on it, like they set it up so perfectly to coerce us into buying something we had no intention of buying. And we hold a grudge 10 years later, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because we know we got tricked. We know we got manipulated, and it wasn't a free choice. And that's something fairly minuscule in the grand scheme of things. But when you're talking about persuading someone to not undertake a course of action they feel otherwise justified in taking, you're just going to build resentment and a grudge, right? It's going to make it even worse. And I think from my perspective too, looking at some of the organizations I've worked with, sometimes when there's a threat made, or there's inappropriate behavior, or there's perception of a threat, the default response is, let's increase our security posture, right? So we have more guards, we have more access control, we have more checkpoints. And on one hand, sure, I mean, hardening your security posture isn't necessarily a bad thing all the time, but if someone was patient, now they know what your surge capacity looks like. Now you've shown your hand. So if we're talking about a terrorism situation or a hate crime or something like that, I mean, you've now just telegraphed this is as hard as things are going to get. Sit back and study what they're doing now, wait for it to relax, and at least then you know what the worst case scenario looks like.
Well, and that's exactly what we've seen. We've seen people intentionally trigger, whether or not it's bomb threats or other related things, right? And intentionally do that surveillance to now find out how they're going to respond, how quickly it takes them to respond, all that intel gathering, and then know how to avoid it, right?
Absolutely.
So you're absolutely dead on. I mean, that's a well-established security penetration process, right? So
Absolutely.
that you're spot on. Yeah.
Yeah. But unfortunately, sometimes those making those security decisions aren't security people, right? They're facilities
Right.
managers, and they're just doing what seems logical at the time, but they haven't really. They're still playing checkers when the other side is playing chess, to use that
Yep.
analogy, and it can sometimes end in disaster. Jim, I just want to just to progress with organizations that might be dealing with troublesome behaviors. Let's say to use what's happening right now in 2021 as an example. I mean, I'm assuming it's the same in the US, but certainly here in our region, this has been an incredibly fertile time for recruitment to issue motivated groups, terrorism organizations. We've had a massive increase in recruitment and radicalization for Islamic groups, in right wing groups, and neo Nazis are popping up again. There's all these sort of groups that are preying upon people being angry and frustrated and confused and vulnerable. And I mean, well, I'm sitting here in Melbourne in what's about to become the world's longest lockdown city, which is an interesting progression because 2 years ago we're the world's most livable city. So it's an interesting slide. But if there's issues of concern, there's behaviors of concern, maybe there's a fear that someone may be radicalized, or they may be taking in hate-filled literature. How does an organization choose the right intervention?
Well, it all comes from the appropriate assessment. I mean, I think one of the things that's so interesting here is dialogue. One of the things, if you're as an organizational member, in other words, you're their employer, you're their church, they're in your church, they're in your community groups, and you have these people that are beginning to act in ways beyond free speech. They're starting to talk about developing action plans. They're starting to take steps to gather materials together. I mean, look at Calhoun and Weston's escalation curve, pathway to violence, and start looking at, gathering materials together, doing other things that you're aware of. I think one of the underutilized things is just to sit down and have a conversation with them.
Amazing, right?
This is true by security services as well as by just employers. And employer representatives. I've done it for my clients. Out of the blue, just say, call up and say, I'm Jim Cawood. I'm a consultant to XY company. I'm aware that or organization, I'm aware that you're very unhappy with what we're doing. And I want to have an open conversation with you to understand the depth of your displeasure and, understand, why. And I'm not promising that I'm going to do anything about it, not going to change it. I'm not going to tell, you're going to get in trouble if you, keep doing this. I mean, all that stuff is all just game playing. And I just want to have a conversation and learn. And it's surprising how many people are willing to have that conversation with you because, are you ready for this? They want to persuade you they're right. They want to rationalize also why they believe they're right to reinforce their own beliefs. And so if I just give them an opportunity and ask questions and want to learn more, and it's clear that my only agenda is to understand, it's surprising how often that can lead to a part of the discussion where I'm not challenging their ideas. I'm trying to help understand the nuances of them that lead them to see how some of their ideas may not lead to the result they want, kind of like the conversation I told you about before with that guy in the Midwest, yeah? And they hadn't really thought about that next third, fourth, fifth step. What would really happen if that happened? They talk about wanting to do this, but what happens if that really happened? What would happen if, the immigrants are no longer here to do the jobs that we have them do that you don't want to do? What happens if we're in a situation where this particular type of individual is now suppressed and thrown in jail? How many jails will we have to have? How high would our taxes need to go? How would we manage that? And it's surprising how often when you begin to spool this stuff out, that begins, they're not being challenged. I'm just trying to figure it out.
You're collectively problem solving
Yes.
Yeah.
And surprising how often that's led to some reassessment on their part, which has then opened up opportunities for other things other than attacking and doing the things that you and I are responsible for, right? To stop. No?
Like so many things in life, it's not about giving them your answers, it's about asking them the right questions. Yeah.
And listening.
Yeah, and listening.
With the perception that you really do want to understand. Not that you'll agree, not that you'll be best friends, not that you'll even like each other, but you truly are just trying to figure it out. Now, there'll be some that won't trust you. They don't want to talk to you. And then that becomes a conversation in and of itself. I can't tell you the number of times I've had individuals, particularly when I'm talking to them initially, and they'll say to me, I got nothing to say to you. I don't want to talk to you. And I'll say, why? Well, because you're, represent such and such. I do. But I've got no agenda here. I'm just trying to figure out what's going on, what the dynamic here is. And it's surprising how often when that becomes, it's not about me, it's about the situation. It's how rare it is that the person still refuses to talk to me at some level, because they do want to be heard. They do want to be the center of attention. They do want to have someone listen to them, and they do want to be able to explain the rationale, because they want to believe, if no other reason, just in their own echo chamber of their brain, they want to believe that what they're doing and saying is justified and right.
Yeah, it's amazing how much starts with a conversation, right? Especially if you're already in a position where you have a relationship, and I see this some of the clients we work with, where they're nervous about having that conversation because they don't want the conversation to change the relationship, but then the relationship has already changed because they're nervous about having the conversation. Right?
Well, that's right. I mean, people are paranoid, but are they really paranoid if you really are avoiding them? Right?
That's right.
So, and I can't tell you the number of times I get hired by clients to go down the hall and have a conversation with someone who they should have the conversation with, but they're uncomfortable for whatever reason. And so I'm just going down the hall to have that conversation because it needs to happen. But they can't do it. They're scared, or they're, not confident, or they whatever. And so I get paid to do that. And and that's ironic because, of course, I come out of the security investigative, law enforcement world, and I got into this work, and I began to realize that it was much more linked to human interaction, human dynamics. And that's why I eventually went back to grad school in psychology and forensic psychology, because I wanted to see that side, but I also knew that clinical psychology wasn't going to work. In other words, most clinicians suck at interacting with people. They just do. And I that sounds like a really broad, incredibly terrible statement, but the fact is that that's been my experience. And psychiatrists are even worse. And so they don't really, they're more than happy to, listen, and then to write down notes and to pontificate about what the person should do. But do they really hear? Are they really problem solvers? I mean, the best therapists and the best HR professionals and the best security professionals are the ones that, think about bouncers as an example. Think about all the bouncers the best bouncers you've ever known that do the work in bars with intoxicated, emotionally crazy people. The best ones are the ones that can just sidle up and have a conversation, have an interaction with the person. The guy or gal knows they're serious. They know that eventually, if it's going to go down, then everyone's going to get hurt, but usually they're going to get hurt more. And they just have that conversation, and it just kind of calms everything down. Yeah. It gets taken care of, right? You don't need to put your hands on people until you do. And so all that's true. So anyway, so it is a conversation, and but you have to have the confidence to do it. You have to know where it goes. For instance, what happens if the individual says, I'm going to commit suicide right now? One of the biggest things happening right now in COVID is I'm getting a huge number of suicide cases where people have talked about committing suicide, and clients are very upset because they're hearing this stuff and they don't know what to do. And there's a limit to what they can do or what they should do, but that's a whole nother conversation, right? But the fact is that they're scared, and therefore they're overreacting in many cases and make it worse. For instance, unless someone's eminently telling you, I'm hanging up the phone and I'm going to go and I'm going to commit suicide, right? If you're in an organizational setting and you're hearing this from one of your employees or one of your, church members or whatever, and you're basically asking law enforcement to go do a wellness check, that may be the worst possible thing you can do. Because the fact is law enforcement shows up and they're now embarrassed. If they weren't actually in the process of doing it, they're embarrassed. They're of course going to lie to law enforcement about what they're willing to do, right? And now they have a record that law enforcement's been called, right? So it's now a long-term destabilizer for them and potentially harmful to them. All without the ability for law enforcement to do more than, if they truly think they're eminent, they can take them down for evaluation. But basically 95% of those evaluations do not end up in long-term care in most Western countries. I don't know if Australia is that way, but certainly in the United States, 95% of those evaluations take place in 15 minutes and the person's back on the street. Because there isn't enough facilities, there aren't enough eminence to the risk, right? And so now the person's been humiliated, upset, and yet they're still now even more destabilized.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that just gives you one more example about how we have to be careful about what we set in motion, in that network. So anyway,
how would you go about an escalation? Let's say, it's topical at the moment because there's a webinar coming up that I shared that stirred up some conversation on my LinkedIn feed about psychopathy in the workplace.
Yep.
I'm sure you've had experience interviewing people where it's just sort of triggered for you, like this person might be a psychopath. This person has
Oh, absolutely. Yep.
If you can't make any ground there when it comes to the interview, or you don't feel like you're going to hit a resolution, how do you choose an escalation from there?
What do you mean an escalation?
As in terms of what I guess your next step, as opposed to an escalation in danger. But I mean, if we can't get anywhere with the interview in terms of getting them to be introspective or to consider the impact on other people, what's your next step from that point? Or how do you choose that next step?
Well, actually, there's a whole. It's funny because Mike Prodian, who's the chief criminal profiler for the South Carolina and used to be the chief criminal profiler for California. Mike and I teach a course for ASIS, and we actually talk about this. In other words, one of the things you have to do in assessment is be able to understand the psychopathy checklist revised and be able to understand those, start keeping those elements in mind as you're looking at a case. And the more elements that potentially point to psychopathy and the greater number of those elements, the more you understand that individual views the world differently than an emotion-based person. And then how do you still make that connection? Remember, they're not they could be psychotic, but often they're not. They're just psychopaths, right? So as you said, they lack empathy, they lack concern about anyone else. But who are they concerned about? Themselves. So I had a case involving an individual who, actually a case in the Midwest, another one in the Midwest, where a guy, it's a very long case, and I'm not, we could spend another hour on this case, but bottom line is this, is that he was a 24-year-old guy who had just gone from one state to another state to take on this job, and he was a stone cold psychopath. He had gone to prison at 16 for shooting a guy over $6 debt. He'd been turning women out for tricks at 16. He was a drug dealer. He had all these other things in his past, and he ended up getting in and out of prison like 3 or 4 times between 16 and 24. And then decided he was going to, didn't like the cycle anymore, but because it was too restraining on him. And he ends up getting hired by my employer because they could only do a background check in the state where he was, not the prior state, which was where all the information was that I found. And so he goes to work for them. And then a whole series of events so now he comes to my attention. And there was no doubt going into the interview that he was a psychopath. There's just no doubt in my mind at all that he was a psychopath. And frankly, a guy who was more than capable of killing. And so we got into this conversation, but my whole mindset was, what, if anything, does he care about? And Mike and I train this. When you know that, when you're dealing with a psychopath or someone who's antisocial, is there anything they care about? Is there anything that matters to them? Not from an empathetic perspective what's going to happen to someone else, but them. What still drives them? What makes them want to continue to get up in the morning? And how can I connect not acting violently against my people to that thing they care about? So again, they willingly choose not to do it. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
now,
absolutely.
if it turns out there's nothing that worked that way, then the short answer is then you try to figure out a quick way to incarcerate them and keep them incarcerated as long as you possibly can, because they will be dangerous forever, and they're going to continue to be dangerous to everyone that they run into at some level. And so you try to do what you can to get them in prison and containment, and then you keep them there as long as you can. But of course, that doesn't last forever. So that's the short answer. But in this case, actually, we had a dialogue with the guy, and after 2 hours of interview, he actually looked at me and he goes, you know what? He says, I'll make you a deal. And I said, what? And he says, you let me leave, you fire me, whatever, I'll leave the organization, and you agree that you won't let anyone in the community know I'm here. And if you don't, then I'll come back and kill everyone here. Pretty straightforward thing. I already knew that actually was a possibility as an outcome. You know, I already had that thing. So basically, I had already talked to my client about the possibility of just letting him resign, in essence, and go back into the community, because there wasn't any way to control him. In other words, he hadn't done anything in that community that was going to allow anyone to do anything to him. In other words, he was on no one's radar screen. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I can't stop someone from coming in, and if they have that full intent and not harming people. No security scheme can possibly do that. Whether or not they're going to find them at their homes, whether or not they're going to find them in the street, you cannot have complete security, and you and I both know that. So I said to him, I said, I will not, notice the words I'm using, I will not tell anyone in the community that you're here. And he goes, okay. And we ended the interview, and he left, and he took all his stuff, and he went in the community and never came back or in any way attempted to attack any of my people and my client's people there. Now, my client was not happy with that, clearly, in the sense that they understood the need to do it, but they were not happy morally with what happened. But I'd already planned for that too. So I made a couple calls to some people geographically significantly different from where I was, and started and put feelers out through that network. So the network at a vastly different geographic location alerted through their resources with no ability to be traced back to me. Make sense? That this guy was in the community, and they probably ought to watch him. 6 months later, he was arrested, went to prison for about 12 years for the work he was doing in the community. But I didn't lie. You notice I didn't lie.
Yep.
I didn't say, I told them I would not tell people in the community. I didn't. I told someone else way out of the community who I know would tell people in the community.
Yeah, and of course, the line of questioning wouldn't have had anything to do with what they've heard in your interview, so it would have
exactly.
Yeah,
has nothing to do with that.
Yeah,
nothing would have come out, right? And so, but that's in some ways that's what you have to do with psychopaths. I mean, and you have to. They first find out if there's anything they do care about. Just because you're a psychopath doesn't mean you don't have things you care about.
Yeah.
Whether or not it's wealth, whether or not it's own personal control, whether or not whatever it is, right? So you just have to be aware. And I've told this story before about this guy in the Midwest. So this is not, I'm not putting anything on tape that I haven't already told thousands of people when I've been training them, because it's a great case study that I first teach them to use the grids to assess the individual. And then we talk about what the intervention would look like. Yeah. So, but it's a true case. It's a real case. And ultimately that's with psychopaths. And about 12% of my caseload involves people with high numbers of psychopathic tendencies. Whether or not they're psychopaths or not, they have a significant number of psychopathic tendencies. And of course, I've been trained in the Psychopathy Checklist Revised. I have the degree and the ability to make those assessments that could stand up in court. But I don't get into labeling. I look at the number of factors. I actually keep a slide by my desk of the 20 different factors that you look at in the psychopathy checklist revised that can indicate when they're solidly present that the individual at a certain level of those being accumulated, that the person's a psychopath. I keep that slide by my desk literally, and I literally go through it every case. And there's always every case has 3 or 4 of those involved. But when I'm starting looking at 10 of them, 12 of them involved with this individual, now I'm much more attuned to making sure that I'm learning about everything else on that list and what's present or what hasn't been present to the degree I can, and then act accordingly in terms of how I interact with them. Because if a psychopath believes that you have mistaken who they are, and they believe that you think they're emotion-based, then you're just an idiot, and they'll be happy to lead you around by the nose and tell you whatever they think you want to hear to get out of the room and have control. Right? And conversely, if I treat an emotion-based person as if they're a psychopath, then of course I've also misunderstood them. And how am I going to be able to influence them if in fact I've so radically misunderstood how they view the world?
Oh, that's fascinating.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's the same thing.
So good.
But cuts both ways.
Yeah. Jim, we are coming up on time, but there's one question that I would like to ask you, just to your 5,000 plus cases of experience and obviously been in this field for forever. I'm curious about whether it was early on in your career or whether it's or later on even. Was there a time when you really just got something completely wrong and it was a big learning curve for you in terms of something that you expected to happen or a way you expected something to play out that you look back on and you go, that changed how I perceived this particular issue?
That's an interesting question. First of all, I learn literally on every case. I mean, I learn something on every case. I mean, every individual is different. Every situation is different. Even though they have similarities with other cases or echoes with other cases, particularly as you said, when you get to my caseload, it's pretty rare I'm going to run across a case that's completely unique. In fact, even partially unique. But the fact is that I still learn something. So the question is, have I ever had a moment where I was just horribly wrong? And the answer is, knock on wood when I say this, the answer is no. I really haven't yet experienced a moment where I was horribly wrong. When I made mistakes in interviews, absolutely. When I made mistakes in terms of how I might have better set up security to stop someone from getting through the first layer and getting to the second layer when they in fact came back, yes. But I haven't had someone yet on my watch who's gotten killed, and the people that have killed, I've actually assessed that they would eventually kill, but it wasn't to my protectees. And I've had that happen, and that includes suicide. I've anticipated and had a high probability that people will commit suicide, certain individuals, and in fact they've gone on and committed suicide at some point, in subsequent to my interaction with them. So no, I don't think. I mean, so to answer your question, I learn from every case, and there's always I always look for those moments to learn. But I'm pretty conservative. When in doubt, I always do more. I'll put it that way. Yep. I always put in more security. I always do more work. I always learn more. I try to get better data. So I think that streak of being, or that methodology of when in doubt, do more. I think has helped me up to this point from having those bad times, and frankly, but we have to anticipate it's going to happen. Just like doctors have a certain, there's a certain number of patients are going to die. We have to recognize in this field that even though we don't get the same grace doctors do, one failure in some cases can ruin your entire career, depending on how prominent that failure is. The fact is that we have to anticipate in the work. You have to know going into this work and live with the reality that you can fail and people could get hurt or die. And if you're not comfortable being in a world where you're making those decisions, then you shouldn't do the work. And I'm not holding it against anyone who doesn't want to do this work. Don't misunderstand me. People ask me sometimes whether or not my children, do I want them to become threat assessors? And the answer is absolutely not. I want them to find out what they want to do, and I want them to do it to the best they can, and hopefully they'll lead happy lives. But no, I don't want my children doing this work.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's I love two things you said. One, firstly, was about you're thinking about whether I asked the question the right way or whether we pursued a different line of questioning, and it connects back to something that we teach professionally to organizations regarding being a high reliability organization, and one of the key principles is a preoccupation with failure and the ability to identify those early failures as quickly as possible. And while they're not failures in that the result wasn't a failure, the fact that you're continually identifying, okay, that question wasn't the right way, or that wording wasn't correct, or this particular piece of the security infrastructure, while the consequences weren't catastrophic, that's something to learn upon. And I think that's a tremendous lesson for anyone in any field, is to continually look for those little tiny, those micro elements of improvement. And as you say, up to 5,000 cases, I mean, you see these patterns play out so many different ways. So many times, rather, consistently, that those little learnings pay huge dividends over time.
They do. And at the same time, if you really get in that mindset, which is I agree with you, I think is the only way to really do this work well over a long period of time, is you begin to start building an anticipation for what you're missing, right? I mean, one of the things is you're constantly saying, okay, am I missing this? Is there something here? Because you're so working against bias and against the idea that you're going to get caught out by, underestimating something, that then you start getting really engaged with, oh my God, is this going to be the case where, I missed something? And so it's really kind of an interesting self-building process and self-reinforcing process, because the more cases you do, just statistically, the more you worry it's just going to happen because it's the numbers. You know what I mean? You're just the numbers are going to lead to it, right? So.
I apologize if I've jinxed you now by asking the question.
Well, it is what it is, right?
Cawood's on record as saying he's never had a screw up. There we go.
No, I didn't say I didn't have a screw up. I just said that I didn't have a screw up that I didn't anticipate was probable to happen. Let's put it that way. Right?
All right. Well, I think that will cover you. That's good. All right, Jim. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us. It's always an amazing honor to sit under the learning tree from people such as yourself, and I appreciate all the work you've done. Obviously, the teaching that you continue to do, the books you continue to write, and the articles have been foundational in my journey through threat assessment and threat management. So I would certainly appreciate you on a personal level. I know our listeners do the same. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you once again to Dr. Jim Cawood for an enlightening episode. Make sure you check out the bonus content case study with Dr. Jim at patreon.com/managing violence. We'll be back in 2 weeks with the one and only Rick Shaw, the author of the First Preventers Playbook. Until then, I'll talk to you next time.